Are you ready to go beyond pen test reporting? Elevate your offensive security and measure risk reduction by streamlining pen test planning, report creation, and findings delivery. Request and attend a one-on-one personalized demo today at securityweekly.com/PlexTrack, and PlexTrack will send you a Starbucks $10, euro, or pounds gift card totally free just for your time. That's securityweekly.com/PlexTrack.
Hi, folks. I'm Adrian Sanabria, the host of Enterprise Security Weekly. Every week, we interview the most interesting folks we can find talking about the most pressing cybersecurity issues and challenges facing the enterprise today. Myself and my co-hosts have each been in the industry for decades, long enough to see the patterns in the industry and explore where trends are going. In addition to enterprise challenges, we also follow the vendor space, the most interesting security startups emerging, technology and product trends, all of the most interesting funding and acquisition announcements. Finally, we love to discuss the latest trends in tech and how they'll impact cybersecurity. If you're wondering how the latest in AI, quantum computing, cloud, and DevOps is going to impact security a few years down the road, you should follow the Enterprise Security Weekly podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Mr. Lee Neely has joined us. Lee, welcome.
Good to be here. Happy Wednesday.
Happy Wednesday.
What day is it?
Today is Wednesday.
It's hump day.
It's hump day. And we are now in the security news. And I just...
Hey, real quick, before we get to arguably the biggest story of the week,
yes.
Can we inject a little bit of maybe fun humor into a story here real quick? Because I put in 3 different stories, and I think you may have even had one of them, and they're all related.
Is it the toothbrush story?
Yep.
Yeah.
So
yes. I hate it when my toothbrush hacks me.
3 million malware-infected smart toothbrushes used in Swiss DDoS attacks. The botnet causes millions of euros in damages.
And I read this and I believed it at face value.
Yep. And
I was like, well, that's kind of...
I did the same.
Because it's not implausible. Larry and I, like, you know, us on the show, like, we're like, yeah, you know what? Like, that's totally possible.
We've done enough IoT stuff. We've seen toothbrush hacks recently. And we've talked about
Mirai botnet, sure.
Yeah.
We've seen Android botnets and Android.
We've literally seen toothbrush hacks and talks about remote code execution on toothbrushes and in the show toys. Within the last couple of years.
For some people, that could be the same thing.
And then... maybe vagina dentata, what? But in any case, the point being here is when I saw this story, I literally had to go and see what date it was. Like, is it April 1st?
Yeah.
And I feel like I've been doing that a lot more often lately.
Yes.
Like probably once every 2 weeks, I like see this security news stories and I go, is it April Fool's Day?
Your poop detector's going off.
Oh my God. And like
your BS meter.
And I read the article and I'm like, well, there's not a lot of technical details and all this type of stuff, but it was so from Mythbusters. Plausible? Confirmed, denied, plausible. Like to me, this one had plausible written all over it. And then we find out that surprising 3 million hacked toothbrushes story goes viral. Is it true?
No.
Turns out it's not.
But so has it been? What I read was there was a bleeping computer article about it that was the one that I read that kind of was in an effort debunking it. And what it didn't necessarily say that we had evidence that this didn't happen, but it said that we didn't have evidence that it did happen. And to me, those are two totally different things. That I believe it was Fortinet that did the analysis and said there was a huge, DDoS thing and it stemmed from the toothbrushes, but that we didn't have like real hard evidence that this had happened.
Yep.
And that's when my BS meter goes off too.
So from the Forbes article, there was an original article that appeared in the Swiss newspaper, and I can't pronounce it, Aringer Zeitung. And the Forbes folks had a native German speaker look at it. And it says that the original article doesn't mention any type or model of toothbrush, the name of the victim or the suspected perpetrator, or the motive behind the distributed denial of service attack. And it appears to be a rather generic tale of warning for the need to protect any device, large or small, connected to the internet. And it is largely theoretical in a warning to go protect your shit.
mean, if we think about this logically, right, like from a technology standpoint, a DDoS attack is not really that, like, it's plausible, but what is the point of doing it from toothbrushes when we're just sending traffic? So we're leveraging IP addresses from a NAT inside where the toothbrushes are connected to the internet.
Yeah, but Tyler, I read that as the toothbrushes were sent to attack the company that made them. And I was like, well, that's something like, yeah, it sounds like a movie plot, but not implausible. Maybe someone had like an axe to grind with that company and was like, hey, I'm going to use your own devices against you and I'm going to attack the company. To me, that gave it validity, but it was clarified, I think, before we finalized the notes for the show. Tom's Hardware made an update at 3:30.
I love that you have to move back to get the screen to focus.
3:30 Pacific time, so that's like
6:30 p.m.
Yeah, that's like an hour ago. Okay, they said so. Fortinet released a statement to Bleeping Computer that says, and I quote: "To clarify, the topic of toothbrushes being used for DDoS attacks was presented during an interview as an illustration of a given type of attack. It has not been based on research from Fortinet or FortiGuard Labs. It appears that due to translations, the narrative on this topic has been stretched to the point where hypothetical and actual scenarios are blurred."
Yep.
Now it makes sense.
I'm glad Fortinet's working on a priority thing that's not their product.
As a follow up to this story, in a very similar vein, my story number 9 is an article from Malwarebytes that is how to tell if your toothbrush is being used in a DDoS attack, and the article is a total of 2 words. It's not.
But I also
played.
Also, I want to the hypothetical and actual scenarios. I think a lot of us can come into hypothetical. I mean, you can stuff an ESP32 in a toothbrush.
Yep.
It's conceivable. The form factor is there. You can absolutely do that. That could potentially give it Wi-Fi and Bluetooth access. You could use Bluetooth, perhaps over low energy.
Maybe they already
to define the Wi-Fi network. You can put your toothbrush on the Wi-Fi network. That subsystem could certainly be compromised by attackers.
To use to send packets for DDoS amplification.
Correct.
So this is the CSI Cyber.
Yes.
Where I watched CSI Cyber, and everybody was all the folks that we were friends with in the industry like, that show is crap. It doesn't work like that. And like, we know it doesn't work. We know it doesn't work like that. But to go to like my mom and to say, hey, your toothbrush could be used for DDoS, and we can pull those parallels of like, it's got an ESP32 in it. You could put an exploit in that. And it's connected to the network. And
authenticated API endpoints.
You can draw those lines to get that to the 6th grade reading level to tell to someone. Yeah, it's totally true. It's totally plausible.
But I think the threat to your data, the threat to your network is
the threat to your dental hygiene.
It could be a threat to your dental hygiene, potentially. I mean, also, you could just use like a regular toothbrush or an electric toothbrush that doesn't have an ESP32 in it and be totally fine. I don't think that the world necessarily benefits in any great way from your app on your phone reminding you that you haven't brushed your teeth today, right?
Yeah. And attackers are probably, if like, we're talking about DDoS, like, why wouldn't they just go steal some creds and rent an AWS instance for an hour and have way more than 1 million toothbrushes?
Or, leverage any number of RCEs on VPN appliances that all the other attackers are doing.
Damn.
Right? I mean, you could always do that.
That's a segue. Let's go for it.
That's a crowded environment right now, though.
It's like the movie Hackers, where you were the one invading on my territory. I was hacking the TV network, not you. Like, I'm hacking all the Avanti servers, not you. Get off my territory, I think, is where we're at. And I don't want to necessarily pick on Avanti, but I want to pick on Avanti a little bit because what grinds my gears is a number of
Lindsay
things.
Lindsay Lohan?
Is metaphorically speaking, Lindsay Lohan. But my story number 10, and there's a lot of articles about this because there's a lot of CVEs and quite a number of things to unpack in what I'm deeming to be quite a dumpster fire.
Yeah.
And
honestly,
I'm being a little bold and brazen here that I necessarily wouldn't be in my day job, but I'm not representing my employer, Eclipsium, in this story. I will maybe in the next story, but in this story, I'm not representing my employer. This is Paul speaking. I think it's a dumpster fire. I think that it's an amazing feat of so many mistakes that lead to an SSRF vulnerability.
An amazing feat of fecal matter manipulation.
Yeah.
Quote a term from our earlier days.
Yes, because it is indicative of that. But so there's an essence. So one of the things that got me about this whole thing, and I don't want to go through all this, the CVEs and how
because we've had them in the show notes for weeks.
Yeah, but so one of the CVEs that is the SSRF vulnerability stems from a supply chain attack in a piece of software that came from the Shibboleth project that was patched in June 2023. So Avanti has that on their system. They've conceivably either known about it or could have known about it since June of 2023 when Shibboleth was patched, and they didn't up their software, back in June of last year. So then you've got other. Hold on, let me talk.
Is it currently unpatched? Is it currently unpatched?
They have released patches for, I believe, all of these.
Go.
But so you stick that in the back of your brain, right? There's an unauthenticated SSRF, right?
Bad.
That doesn't necessarily get you code execution. However, there was a remote code execution that was remotely accessible that Avanti fixed by filtering out those requests. Right? So like they're like, oh great, well like we fixed that issue like by basically just making the external processes, the external side of the server not able to process those requests. The RCE still exists in the back end.
Oh God, on the local side.
You couple that with an unauthenticated SSRF. Now I essentially, as an attacker, have access to the back end. So I couple the SSRF with the RCE that still exists in the back end. I can reach the back end now. Now I combine those two together, which is exactly what attackers are doing today, combining these two flaws together for command execution.
Two great tastes that taste great together.
That's right, on the one. So that's the whole thing. So also, I've learned that in order to do like forensics, to take like a forensic snapshot, because now the question is, if you got an Avanti Pulse Secure, is that what they call it? Avanti Pulse Connect. That's the other thing with this whole thing is all the names of all the products and companies have changed over time. Because this was
Fortinet, AnyDesk.
No, it wasn't. There wasn't Fortinet. Like there was Pulse Secure. It was Pulse Secure, but now it's Avanti. Now it's Avanti. The names escape me, but anyway, so you got one of these devices. Let's say you want to do forensics on it and go, is my VPN appliance compromised or not? Like that's a valid question that you should be able to answer, or at least have some facilities to answer. Your facility to answer that is a forensics tool that when you run it, reboots your VPN appliance. Now, those of us that have been IT administrators in any capacity know that rebooting your VPN appliance is persona non grata. Like that's not something you want to bring to your management, to the executives in your company, go, yeah, guess what? Like, if we want to check every couple of hours that our VPN appliances aren't owned,
shit's not hacked,
I got to reboot it. And rebooting it kicks all of your users off. So that's, in my mind, not a viable solution. They don't provide a shell. They don't provide great access to their firmware either. So, like, if you have a support contract, you only get access to the firmware of the devices that are in your support contract.
Yeah.
So they're protecting their intellectual property in one vein, but they're also preventing us from looking at that. My other thing that grinds my gears is like, hold on, you're telling me that if I want to use your product, I got to take your appliance,
virtual or not. Yep, magic blinky lights.
Virtual or not, I got to plop it on my network, and you're going to give me zero visibility into that device, and you're not going to tell me what's in that device. So you're not going to give me an SBOM, and you're not going to allow people to evaluate your firmware. But guess what? People have evaluated their firmware. And you know what they found? Because if you go to a Mastodon post that I linked to, that I didn't put in the show notes, but someone, and I apologize for forgetting your name, but you'll see it in my day job tweet. They found that you're running all kinds of old open source software. Some of it's 14 years old on your devices. I'm not okay with this, and I don't want to be like adversarial about it, and I apologize if they came off of adversarial if you work for or represent any of these companies. It's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's a much better way to approach this, that we can all work together to make sure that all of your concerns are addressed, that you're protecting your intellectual property, but also that we're able to evaluate and get a bill of materials and ingredients list and some visibility into these devices, because we need that. We all need that. And I think that the vendor that can provide this appliance and these services that allows for the security research community, that allows for their customers to have some visibility about what they're putting in their networks, that you're going to be the winner. And that's how I want to shape the industry conversation, but that's not where we are today. I need a drink.
Oh, did Sam leave us?
No, Sam's still here.
Oh,
Okay, sorry. I can't.
I'm still here.
Okay, so
Sam.
sorry. The monitor number 4 has the two of us and not Sam. So I was like, wait,
So
where'd Sam go?
I do have a question around this. Like, okay, we've got a lot of bad news that's happening. We have some really bad vendors doing bad things, and there's a lot of actors that are abusing things that are coming out that put people's houses on fire. We have to deal with those in day job, all over the place. So now we've got IR, we've got deconfliction, we've got attribution, we've got blog posts, we've got marketing, we've got executives all over us asking us if this is going to affect us. How do we reshape this conversation into a form that makes this constructive and allows the vendors and or vendors that aren't affected to do what they have to do, because marketing and or executives ask the questions and want to be, profiting off of stuff? How do we reshape this so that every time we have these things, we have constructive conversations, we have constructive insights online in the social medias, the Twitters, whatever they are now, and we're getting stuff done while meeting the things that we have to do for day jobs, so that we can actually do what we need to do to make sure that the house does not stay on fire? How do we change this conversation?
It's economic incentives and smart regulations. And I can sit here in my pulpit all day and say that's the answer, but those aren't easy things to achieve, right? But in the first one, we have to make sure that it's an economic incentive. It's that buyers are going to buy something that is more secure, that reduces my attack surface, and we have to put that in the economic incentive for the buyer to choose more wisely, right? To know that what I'm about to put on my network, I want to know, does that increase my attack surface? Does that reduce my attack surface? And what are the policies and practices that I should be taking into account before I go buy this and put them in my network? We also need smart regulation that doesn't squash innovation, that doesn't put barriers to entry, but also forces the hand of vendors to have good practices in good security practices that are coupled with the products that they bring to market. Mm-hmm. Sam.
I think CISA deserves a shout out. They've really been helpful on this and other issues, and they were right on the Ivanti thing with clear instructions telling everybody to disconnect it and how to clean it and put it back. And I think we're adding a lot to the conversation here.
Yeah,
better than I expected.
But so here's what I implore those that are defending enterprises today. Do you want to be in a situation where you're going to be ripping machines out and going through the work of rebuilding them and putting them back online, only for conceivably for this to potentially happen again? Or do you want to be in a better position? And if you could have some indicators beforehand, I think that would make everyone's lives much better.
Right. And
well, sure, but I mean, the signs beforehand are always sort of weak and confusing. The hard part is the judgment call of which ones of these possible threats are really important.
Right. Well, I mean, to that
you also
end,
run into. Go ahead, Lee.
I was going to say, if you've got threats on your boundary control devices, access control devices, those pretty much better be at the top of the list. And if your bloody vendor can't keep up with the issues, it's a time to really reassess the risk.
That was kind of where I was going. I mean, even if we look at our defense in depth, we look at our zero trust. Like, I don't even know what it is today, which pillar or buzzword we're leveraging for defense in depth. Like, even if we look at that, like picking good vendors, no one's going to get fired for putting in Cisco, and yet Cisco has vulnerabilities. No one's going to get fired for usually putting in Ivanti. Like, we have seen this across just about every platform. And we predicted this back at the beginning of COVID, right? We said the external boundary, all the VPN devices, the firewalls, the boundaries, we're going to see exponential research into and the exploitation of these devices because of where we're moving for remote workforce, where we were going for visibility into networks, and or how actors are going to have to move because the endpoint was getting more difficult. And here we are. So now how do we begin to build and protect this, because we don't know who's going to be next? Maybe it's Palo Alto, maybe it's, whatever edge device you're using, maybe it's Cloudflare. Like, all of these companies have had their issues and are going to have their issues. So now how do we begin to secure? Because the end day or 0 days that come out, like, by that time and the point that it hits public, it's too late for you if you are one of the ones that are targeted or hold very sensitive information. So how do we defend against that?
To that point, one of my thoughts are the vendors aren't necessarily going to do this on their own. There needs to be external pressures. Now, again, I don't want to over-regulate and create barriers to entry in the market and shrink the market into the duopolies because they're the only ones that can comply with, federal regulations. That's not what I'm saying. But I do like the FCC as kind of a model, right, for this particular scenario. And this model, and what us hackers love, is that if you're going to transmit radio frequencies in products here in the US, you have to get an FCC ID. Is this like would you call it approval, Larry, or would you call it a certification?
It's approval.
It's approval. It's a requirement. They have to do it.
It's the law.
It's the law. Okay. So that's taken into a little maybe of an extreme when we go to like VPN appliances, but sure. I do like the model in that I'm going to bring a product to market. I then have to go through the application process to the FCC, and they take that and they test that to certain standards. And I think, Larry, largely what they're doing when you see that FCC ID is making sure, I think one of the things they obviously do is making sure that if I say it's going to transmit on these radio frequencies, they test it to make sure it only transmits on those radio frequencies.
So
right?
and just for clarity, the FCC doesn't do any testing at all.
Oh, so
the people that submit are required to have a third party perform the test and submit
So those
the
pictures
test results.
we see aren't an FCC lab necessarily. There's a certified testing lab that they have to send it to. I like that model better. Okay, it removes some of the government, kind of red tape from that.
And this is good to that model because you need to have some audit, pen test, supply chain security,
open it up to the free market. Hey, if you similar to PCI, like if you want to have some independent third party evaluate their thing, that independent third party has to get a certificate down there validated to go. I want to validate these devices.
Not if you want. If you must.
You must. But the free market portion is there's a process for organizations to be that independent third party, and there's a market for that. So they create a market essentially. And what I'm advocating for is a similar thing to, let's take network appliances, right? Let's say there's some standard. Your device in software and hardware has to attest to the certain standard. By the way, here's a list of a dozen or more vendors that have certified, that can certify your device to the standard. You get your stamp of approval. And I'm not saying it's perfect. Look, none of this stuff is perfect. PCI is not perfect. FCC is not perfect. None of this stuff is perfect, but it's better than what we have today, which is there is no standards or regulations, conceivably. I mean, there are, but just for the sake of argument, say there's very little standards and regulations. It means companies can go, I have this great device and I'm going to sell it to you, and it's a dumpster fire, but whatever, I'm just going to keep pushing patches until I'm blue in the face, and you have to deal with the consequences. To me, that's not a model that's sustainable moving forward.
Tyler's got a big button here.
But does that fix this? Like this, so we have all of these kind of regulatory, like we're talking about, some of these are esoteric vulnerabilities, some of these are egregious, like let's be real. But at the same time, like almost all of these appliances companies have had these products tested or have them third party tested in order to be part of FedRAMP, in order to be what's inside of any of the regulatory bodies. In fact, even to just get put into many of the corporations, they have to have even another round of third-party validations for procurements. So aren't we already kind of doing this, and therefore we are already failing at that? So how do we do this differently or better?
I think we need tighten the regulations. Obviously, what we're looking for is not moving the needle, right? We need to say, you've got really old software, you've got exploitable vulnerabilities. And granted, we're not going to catch everything, right? But there needs to be some model where there's a minimum viable security standard for these companies. We can't rely on, some independent third-party vendor that, let's be frank, a lot of their motivation is marketing, has looked at the device and uncovered vulnerabilities. And yes, the byproduct is they're making the world a safer place, but also they're trying to make a name for themselves. And I don't fault them for either thing, don't get me wrong, but that's not a viable model moving forward. I think that they must be compelled to provide an SBOM, must be compelled to provide access to firmware for independent evaluation for a set of predefined and evolving security standards. I mean, you heard Sergey talk about all kinds of ways to exploit things, right? It has to keep up with all this.
Yep.
Yeah, I think really changing the conversation and the, like you said, the incentive really for companies in order to maintain profits, keep surviving and growing, because they've got board, they've got stockholders, they've got shares that they've got to meet certain goals, and all of those things don't necessarily align with security. So from a business standpoint and from the capitalistic standpoint, how do we start to reframe some of this so that there's an incentive or credit for these companies to do that? Otherwise, as a capitalist nation and, through business economics, security will never be a viable solution for many of these companies.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
All right.
Hey, but just to give some participation here, I'd love to hear from Sam before we go into your big one, because I know we're going to spend a shit ton of time on it, and Sam's got to leave soon.
Yeah, well, the one I thought was probably most important is the spyware one, the Google Threat Analysis Group, exposing the commercial spyware industry. There's like 40 groups doing it. It's not just government. And this affects me. I always have people coming to me telling me that their life has been ruined because people are stalking them everywhere they go and hacking all their computers. And, I'm increasingly believing it. This really could happen. And it wouldn't really require a nation state or somebody with $1 million to get spyware that could track you everywhere and mess up your life. So I think we need to do something about it. And right now we're just at the stage of exposing it as a real threat. So it'll probably be years before there's effective government action, but it is an increasing problem. I have several students I know in this position where their life is greatly harmed by some kind of stalker stalking them everywhere through the computers.
I don't know if stalking, so I will take a secondary approach to this, because you are right. There are a lot of actors and there's a lot of compromise in the world right now. However, I'm going to preface that and say that most of what I see and most of the things in which skids, crime actorware groups, people doing this for some small amount of money, they're using very low sophistication, or at least middle sophistication, to do this. And typically it is self-induced. A lot of this is from cracked software, watching cracked TV, installing extensions, doing insecure things. So you end up with stealers on your device, and it's very difficult to get these companies out because you reuse your password everywhere once the stealers in the browser.
But Tyler, also tokens, right? there's a very distinct connection to adware and spyware, right? Like it's almost kind of like lumped in the same kind of thing, right?
Well,
yeah, I mean, all the stuff that you connect and bring onto your computer from an ad standpoint is almost certainly selling your data, and at a minimum, doing that with tracking. At a more nefarious level is installing cookies and or stealers with inside the browser to get your tokens, get your passwords, snapshot your machine, move from machine to machine because of backdooring one of your SaaS applications, or having access to your Gmail with the same password, right? Like, these can be solved with some basic hygiene and or doing a little bit better job of the fundamentals from a security side, and or as a society, let's start doing things where we're getting rid of passwords, where we're enforcing and using FIDO on phones and leveraging token timeouts from your SaaS providers. Like all of these things where we have a little bit more security by default from providers that are doing some of this is going to help some of the tracking. But to be real, like all of the tracking is monetized by even the big companies. So the little companies that are doing this, it's very easy to write and still available on the endpoints, whether that's your phone or your computer.
You know what's interesting though? You mentioned hygiene, and we talked about the toothbrush story, and I just wanted to take a moment to say that we kind of brushed off the toothbrush DDoS attack.
Wow, man, the story's getting long in the tooth already.
Wow.
Jeez.
Yeah, well, I
You
think
just had to rub that in, didn't you?
And anyway, Tyler, I think what you're talking about mostly is like the privacy risk of targeted ads and stuff. But what I'm talking about is when people really have made a powerful enemy who really is trying to hurt them. And once you somebody like that, it's very hard to get.
You definitely have it. That's available, and people can purchase this for fairly inexpensive from a lot of Telegram channels, a lot of crimeware groups, like the Stealer market and or the crime advocacy market. Like you look at things like the Calm, right? Like you want to go down a dark tunnel, like you can have someone killed, you can have someone's house set on fire, you can pay to have all these things for real enemies. But most of what we're seeing from like breach credentials and accounts being taken over and people being tracked or harassed is legitimately from like Stealer data. You look at Redline or Raccoon or any of the Stealers, millions and millions of infections via botnet or Stealers from a browser extension, from people putting in their credentials for a cracked watch the NFL live ticket on shady ass website. Like that's how these Stealers are handling a lot of these people that end up getting harassed. Almost all of them I can trace back and find which Stealer got into which computer, and it's still living there, and it's been living there for 3 years because you don't change out your computer.
It is these really like practical kind of things that they're preying upon, right? Like when you said watch NFL for free, I kind of thought about like subtitle files in Kodi when you load pirated content, right? They're kind of preying upon you're doing something shady already, so I'm going to prey upon
your kids do it right now. Like I see my kid doing it the other day. It's play Fortnite in the browser on your Switch or your Google tablet, right, where you can't normally play it. They provide a graphical interface, but to do that, you're installing an extension or you're passing that browser access, which gives it full access to all your cookies, and that Stealer is installing itself and maintaining and stealing all those cookies.
You need to get your kids, but you need to get your kids to Asus ROG Alleys so they can play Fortnite on them.
They have that too, but I lock that shit down. That's much easier.
Well, that's Windows 11 with Secure Boot installed by default, and
even then in the browser, Edge isn't stopping a lot of this.
No, because then they're like, I have a browser on here, and maybe Dad's not looking at that browser. And then I look through their search history, and I'm like, no, Dad's looking at that browser. By the way, like this isn't like a free for all. Like knock that off.
And some of them aren't really that. I mean, they're not super nefarious. Like it legitimately, like
dude, my son's
gamesatschool.com.
My son's browser history is like burner phones. I'm like, dude, seriously? Like, you think Dad's not looking at what you do on the internet? Like, you know what Dad does for a living? Like, come on now. Like, if you want a burner phone, like, let's have the conversation. Get your burner phone.
First off, I'm going to ask you a question. Why do you want a burner phone? And then that's cool. Like, let's get a burner phone. Yeah. Like, maybe some discussion.
But I mean, you're also running into like, so even many of the websites that are legitimate, or we'll call them semi-legitimate, you end up with the ad tracking network, and we're talking about adware, right? The ads on the side and the JavaScript, if you're running insecure browsers, insecure software, and the JavaScript that's running inside of those particular browsers, they're still able to then infect and or track you. Maybe not full browser takeover unless you provide that and accept all cookies and all code on that site. Then the Stealers are hopping in and doing it that way. Like the Stealer data right now is almost as serious a problem as ransomware. Like if you look at where initial access brokers are getting credentials, where tokens are being sold and stolen, it is almost all coming from Stealer and Stealer data.
Can they crack your BitLocker?
No, not from a browser.
Not from a browser.
Physical access.
That was one of Sam's other stories. I think it was a hot story this week.
I had one of those.
Right. I think we all had it. Is that Raspberry Pi Pico with some special header, but this is on older systems, from my understanding, that the TPM is separate from the CPU.
Yes.
That in more modern computers, the TPM is inside the CPU,
Yes.
which again, not impossible, but like really, really hard.
That's pretty old,
Sam, go ahead.
right? Like anything that's
Go ahead,
outside-
Sam.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is you didn't even have a boot up password. So that seems like it's a known vulnerability. If you don't have a boot up password, then clearly the key is transmitted every time you boot up. And that's what this weakness is
But
from.
the boot up password. So here's where my knowledge of Bitlocker, because it's like I run Linux, so I'm not forced to understand Bitlocker, which is really bad, and I should understand it better than I do. But what you're saying
you
is
just
that
put a shim and get around it.
the boot up password you're talking about, is that Bitlocker specific, or is that like a UEFI specific BIOS password? Those are two different
Both.
things. Or
It's
is it both?
secure boot.
Of it, but it's a password you put before the operating system even starts, and that's what makes you safe.
So that's in UEFI, and is that essentially
So
like
it is Bitlocker.
It's Bitlocker,
But it's Bitlocker's implementation of secure pre-boot. That is the pre-boot PIN password
So,
in
like,
order to initiate the
what
key
you're saying is,
exchange
like,
to unlock the
after-
keys in TPM.
after exit boot services, that's when it presents you with a password to continue, which would be
It's before that.
before exit boot
It's-
services. Okay.
You read the
Correct.
disk where you put in that password, and that's what protects you from this attack.
Oh,
that's why
because UEFI needs to access the disk before exit boot services. Right.
Yeah, I mean, so turning on BitLocker without this protection seems kind of pointless, and that's why I thought this attack wasn't really very important. I mean, if
Right,
you
because
don't
then
have
you get the PC byte, the guy that did the PC byte thing to sniff the sniff the BitLocker key as it was going across the bus. The password mitigates that attack as well.
yeah,
Okay.
Correct. But I mean, again, you go to Sam, like that seems like common sense, and or you're exactly spot on. This is how BitLocker is supposed to be used, and or practical knowledge. But the fundamentals that we're going back to, like, you would be surprised how many organizations, in fact, I can probably count on three hands how many organizations I've seen use pre-boot PIN passwords, because it is hard to manage at scale and or protect that data. Like BitLocker keys and stuff, that's all managed on Azure AD or ADE and can be controlled, reset. BitLocker PIN pre-boot passwords are a little bit different.
Because it's it's stored in the TPM, and UEFI has to access the TPM. So if I need to reset my PIN, that's a lot trickier.
Unless you're using something like a YubiKey for that pre-boot PIN and password authentication part, which is what
I
really
didn't know
good places are using.
Okay, I didn't know you could do that. So you can have a U2F device be your PIN, basically.
does that YubiKey have a PIN? Because if it doesn't, then the attacker with physical access to the device would also have physical access to that key.
You would hope that they have one of the ones that has a PIN, but for pre-boot, they would not need a PIN. That's outside of YubiKey.
Yeah,
so
physical, but YubiKey physical access though, if the user's just leaving it plugged in their laptop all the time, that kind of defeats the purpose of having that separate physical kind of thing. Which
I would say yes,
right?
Yes and no, right? Like that's a different threat vector. I had this discussion at work today, it was yesterday, but what you're trying to do is get to a more secure authentication mechanism. This is the first step in getting to something better, where you're leveraging OAuth, where you're leveraging FIDO2, where you have something that requires a PIN as part of that OAuth authentication or the FIDO2 authentication. You have something you have and something you know, right? Basically, you're moving from passwords that can be brute forced or guessed to something in which you have to have physical access. Now, the threat vector for YubiKey is technically not dissuading physical access unless that is your threat vector and you take it in and out of the device, which is separate from most people and how they use YubiKeys, right? Like you have the really small ones that stay in USB-C and they sit there and you have to tap them. That just is a form of something you have and something you know, and then your PIN. So that's usually not protecting against a physical threat. If you're doing that, then you're doing it a little bit different.
I think we need to do a whole episode on BitLocker. I've been mulling that over in my mind. I think we need a whole thing too, because I also think that, for me, it's some of the compliance standards that are just like blanket. You need to have BitLocker enabled in full disk encryption on every single device. And I'm like, but you're just saying that to like say that. Can we explore like the practical side of it and the actual attack vectors? Like, if there is, like, what are you protecting against? Like, if it's if it's a server that's locked in the data center that is in a building that has an alarm, like, look, if an attacker is going to get in there and steal the server, like, even if you've got BitLocker, the potential that they're going to be able to get access to it is also, like, why would they go through all that trouble when they could just password spray or whatever, phishing attempt? Like, there's a lot of other easier ways. You know what I mean?
The YubiKey is protecting it and getting us to a better passwordless state where we're using Windows Hello for business, and that's leveraging a more secure mechanism in which the secret and or the communication of our secret and password, for lack of a better word, is being handled through a cryptographically safe mechanism. We're moving away from passwords to something more secure, whether or not that is protecting against physical. Again, I think we need to take and make sure people understand what they're protecting against and how they're protecting against it. That was very widely misconceived, even by IT people, of what the YubiKey rollout was there to do. And so the same thing with BitLocker. If you're not doing this correctly and you're not understanding what the threat vector is and or why you're trying to move it that way for the business and why this has to be done in stages so that people understand, adopt, and begin to get comfortable with it, then we're never going to get anywhere, and we're going to still always have passwords as a backup and SMS as your two-factor.
Another big story this week is partly my fault.
Yeah, we need to get to that.
Okay. There's a funny story as to how this happened. It was last Friday, and I was working on a different project for my day job that we haven't published yet. It's something that I'm working on that I will say it's no secret, but it involves Android, right? Kind of dovetailing off some of the publications I've done on Android.
Hey, before you get too far, reach down and grab another beer for me.
Yeah. What do you want?
Grab another Sam Adams.
Sam Adams.
Just because I can pour it in the same glass at the same time.
So last Friday, I'm working on this Android project, right? And it's really because of ADD, right? And we're on this Android thing, and I'm like, I should go like check CVEs because that's, ADD brain. Like, I need a break from focusing. I need to focus on something else now.
Oh, squirrel.
Yeah. Oh, look, squirrel. And so I've got this really cool tool that I found on GitHub called CVE Maker. So if you search for CVE-maker, come upon this GitHub. It's a Python project. It lets you interrogate and query the CVE database in different ways, and it makes it super easy. You type the word critical in your interactive prompt, you push enter, and it shows you the last 20, I believe, critical CVEs sorted by last updated. So not when it was published, but when it was updated. So like, this is how nerdy I get on vulnerabilities. Like, I want to see if someone made an update to an existing CVE, like what was updated. Did they adjust the CVSS score? Did they do whatever, right? So I ran this thing, and Friday afternoon, I'm like, all right, I need a break from the Android stuff. I switched to this ADD brain. I'm gonna go do this as a little distraction. And I read the description, and there's a 9.8 CVE. Now, all the ones in there are 9.0 or above to be deemed critical, right? And this is 9.8 and comes from Red Hat. And I read the description, and it says that there's a remotely accessible buffer overflow in Shim. And I'm like, no. I'm like, seriously? I'm like, no. So I go to
That's how you found this?
Yeah, that's how I found this, dude. And so I go to the NVD entry, and I'm reading it, and it's like, yeah, there's a buffer overflow essentially in the processing of HTTP boot packets, right? That deal with HTTP responses. And I'm like, well, shit, that'd be super bad. Like, if this is real, I'm like,
if this was real, this is a CV entry. If this was real,
also, like, how did I miss this? And I look at it, so I started digging a little more. And like, this CV was created on, or I trace it back to a Git commit entry from December 5th. And I'm like, no.
Okay, that's like a month and a half old.
I read the commit message, and I'm like, yeah, that's a buffer overflow. Like, if I've ever seen a buffer overflow in C code, if like I can identify a buffer overflow in C code, like, it's a really bad buffer overflow. And I'm like, no. I'm like, oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. And so,
like, I could smell your boner from here.
I stick it in our internal Slack, and I'm like, this is Pandora's Box. Like, as soon as I hit enter in our internal Slack at Eclipsium, I was like, this is Pandora's Box. Like, I kind of pushed enter, and I kind of just, like, I waited for a little while.
It's like throwing the hand grenade over the wall.
Yeah. I kind of waited for a little while. I'm like, this is significant. I believe this is significant, but like, I don't want to believe it until like at least one person on my team believes it is significant. And then my coworker, John Lucades, like messages me or called, whatever the communication was. He was like, dude, holy shit. I'm like, oh, so this is like real, huh? I'm like, how did this happen? And so like, I just started digging in, and I'm like, a guy from Microsoft, this guy, Bill Demerkopsky, I forget how to pronounce his last name. Bill from Microsoft, not Bill Gates Bill, but a different Bill from Microsoft is credited as the one of finding it. I'm like, well, that's interesting. I'm like, Microsoft found this. I'm like, Bill works for MSRC. So I'm going to the MSRC blog. I'm like, they haven't posted anything about this. And then like, I'm Googling for the CVE, and I'm like, hang on a second. Like, no one's talking about, I'm like, why isn't anyone talking about this? And then I go back to our internal Slack, and I'm like, and it's just blowing up. And then there's new Slack channels we're calling, like, sounding all the alarms at work. And, you know, my wife's like, are you done with work today? I'm like, nope. Like, my fault. I just opened up Pandora's Box. I didn't find the vulnerability. Our team didn't find the vulnerability. Bill from Microsoft found the vulnerability.
And no one's talking about it.
No one's talking about it. And we just discovered that Bill from Microsoft found this vulnerability. And then it was pretty much like balls to the wall.
And then your wife said, tell me about bootloaders.
Yeah. And then she's like, wait, like, why are you so busy at work? I'm like, there's a huge vulnerability in Shim. She's like, English, please. I'm like, it's a bootloader. And what's a bootloader? It's just hilarious. I'm like, I didn't find the vulnerability, but I'd found the presence of this vulnerability. And I'm like, it's what we do. And I'm like, every vulnerable version of Linux, all Linux is vulnerable. And I'm like, phone my wife. She's like, just go back to work.
Yeah.
Right. So we basically,
honey, I'm a thought leader now.
Yeah. Right. Like, this is significant. I just happened to be the person that stumbled across it, essentially.
And we needed to talk about this, and this is a big deal. Honey, I'm a thought leader now.
But this is our 19th year of doing the show.
Yeah.
I've never seen a vulnerability of this severity not be talked about for so long. Like, I don't know why we as Eclipsium, I mean, I know why, because we have the world's most amazing team, particularly on this particular topic, right? So there was a perfect storm, right? And I'm like, I don't know why we're the ones that are talking about this. I don't know why Microsoft didn't talk about it. I don't know why Red Hat didn't talk about it. I don't know why, like, the guy Bill from Microsoft just put it on his Twitter and no one really noticed. And there was a brief conversation on Mastodon, but like, no one picked up on the significance of this. And I'm like,
you know what? You know why? I think because there are very few folks that may have had the level of understanding that, or noticed that had the level of understanding that folks at Eclipsium do.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, right? Because it's very similar to the boot hole vulnerability. That was one that we did find at Eclipsium, right? And it's very similar to that. So, the attack vectors are very interesting. So like once we, kind of got a hold of this, we were kind of running through all the different attack scenarios.
Yep.
And there was like multiple calls where I'm like, hold on, like, wait a minute, time out. You could bypass secure boot on Windows with this, right? And they're like, yeah, you're probably good. I'm like, if an attacker was somewhere in the middle of an HTTP connection that was HTTP booting, you could respond and send them a vulnerable version of Shim, and then that version called out to a server that you owned, and you could compromise the system that way. I'm like, yeah, so we start running through the attack paths. Like, you can leverage the local vulnerability to exploit secure boot. So like, even if you're not HTTP booting and it's disabled in your BIOS, which, by the way, I checked my, BIOS, and HTTP boot is disabled.
Yep.
I'm like, but you could just tell Grub to load a vulnerable Shim and then tell the vulnerable Shim to load something else that exploits the vulnerability. I'm like, well, that's kind of neat. And then I'm like, wait, Bill also, this is at the point in the story where I was on Y Combinator, Hacker News Y Combinator site, and I had this realization where the Bill who discovered the vulnerability made a post and was like, I just want to set the record straight. Like, these are the different attack vectors, and we've been kind of running through those ever since I found that. I was like, holy crap! Like, no one else. How is no one else seeing this? Am I the only one seeing this? And so he goes through all these attack vectors, and the other attack vector that he was like, well, if you're pixie booting and you're an attacker on the local subnet where you're pixie booting, you could, if you won the DHCP race condition, you could respond with pixie boot. You could load a valid shim, you could load a valid grub, and then you could tell grub to basically chain load a vulnerable shim, and then tell that vulnerable shim to load a payload over HTTP. I'm like, so you can be an attacker like basically anywhere on the internet as long as you're in the middle of the victim server and whatever server they're calling to HTTP boot, because HTTP boot goes over TCP and uses HTTP to load the bootloader in clear text. And most people don't use HTTPS because secure boot should cryptographically validate all the software in your thing, except when one of those components has a vulnerability, like in this case.
It ignores all
Shim.
that.
Yeah. So HTTPS boot obviously mitigates some of the risk, but not all.
But the vulnerabilities in HTTP boot.
Correct.
So
correct.
Yeah, all bets are off.
So yeah, those are the basics. But then I'm like, hold on, wait a minute. I'm like, if there's a vulnerability in Shim, I'm like, doesn't that mean we have to update the DBX? I'm like, but am I understanding this right?
So,
and then like someone else,
quick refresher. What's the DBX?
So DBX is the secure boot revocation list.
Yep.
Hashes or certificates of software that has been deemed to be like not cool to boot in the secure boot process. Software that matches this certificate or hash is involved in the boot process of secure boot stops and goes, I'm not booting your computer.
So meaning the version of Shim that is currently deployed is vulnerable and should not be booted upon.
Correct.
Meaning we need to revoke the certificate in the DBX to prevent it from.
We need to add the hashes and or certificates that represent that version of Shim in secure boot to tell secure boot not to trust that software in the boot process.
Got it.
Right. But that hasn't happened yet. So we don't have a DBX update. Now I described the process of how you do a DBX update in Linux, which coincidentally enough, I had described when I first started at Eclipse, and it was a really hacked way. And then Richard Hughes, who's an amazing contributor to open source, an amazing human being, runs FWUpd, added that functionality into FWUpd and added like nice features into FWUpd that goes, hey, when you're updating your DBX, it does an extra check to say, hey, you're trying to apply the DBX or revocation list, and like the bootloader that you have has a hash that matches a hash in the DBX. So if I apply this update, it means the next time you reboot, secure boot's going to go, I can't boot. And it tells you that before you apply the update, which is nice. So I happened, it's interesting. I had already documented that. Like I already had screenshots and documentation and all that worked. I just copied and pasted it into the blog post. And it's amazing. I checked Bleeping Computer just before the show. And it was like my screenshot from my system where I actually tested that on my desktop. And that screenshot was in Bleeping Computer. I'm like, that's really weird that screenshot's in Bleeping Computer right now. I never imagined a scenario where that screenshot is in Bleeping Computer right now.
Dude, we've been doing this podcast for 19 years, but you know what? You finally made it.
Right?
Yay.
My screenshot is famous. Lee.
So Paul, you triggered a couple of questions.
And same here.
There's a lot of people have lots of questions.
I know. These are mundane old fart questions. For example, when you were describing diskless boots, I was thinking back when we did it with TFTP and there weren't no authentication or validation in the server. But my first question is, I was thinking, we're talking about the secure boot UEFI stuff in Linux. I'm wondering how many Linux systems, particularly in our server environment, more than our laptop, are actually running UEFI. They're not running BIOS anymore.
Oh, you'd be surprised.
Most of it's UEFI.
Yep.
Today. And so Shim was created. I mean, even years ago, I don't know, 3 to 5 years ago, like a lot of Linux didn't support secure boot because of this issue. If your bootloader has to be certified and cryptographically signed with the Microsoft third-party CA to participate in secure boot, right? Now there's over 200 versions of bootloaders, right? Because every Linux distro customizes their bootloader, giving it a unique signature. Microsoft would have to sign hundreds of bootloaders to be valid with secure boot.
Before they can sign it, they'd have to verify it.
And they'd have to verify it, and it goes through a process. So what they agreed upon is that we would take this one smaller piece of software called Shim. We would sign that with the Microsoft third-party CA as a participant in secure boot, and then that Shim software would then validate the Grub2, largely Grub2 bootloader for the rest of the process, so that everyone's Linux distribution didn't have to have their bootloader signed by Microsoft. Microsoft would just sign Shim, and then Shim also has a certificate listing inside, or I think leans on a certificate listing to validate that the next stage is valid. So that's his job in life, is to be valid in secure boot and then validate the next stage, which typically in most Linux systems is Grub2. Now, a lot of you out there listening going, well, this isn't a Linux issue, it's a UEFI issue. Largely, I agree. Shim is not necessarily specific to Linux. While it was created to enable Linux distributions to more easily support secure boot, it can be used as a shim to really boot, anything, right? So I get you that it's not strictly a Linux issue, it's more of a UEFI issue. I agree with you on that point. However, largely, Shim is used to enable secure boot in most modern Linux distributions.
Okay.
You mentioned TFTP boot, so there are scenarios that I've seen where people have commented and said, well, I use Pixie boot, it uses TFTP to get the first stage bootloader, and then it maybe uses HTTP boot to get the next stage bootloader. Like that, you could circumvent that process with Pixie, or you could circumvent that process in HTTP boot. So there's a lot of attack vectors that I don't feel we fully kind of fleshed out. Like I want to have some more concrete examples of how you exploit some of these attack paths that we described in the blog post as such.
All right, so I'm going to ask a couple hard questions that I've already set you up because I've asked some of them earlier today. But so I've got a system, or I've got a firmware image. How can I tell that I'm potentially vulnerable to this attack?
It's a great question.
Well, what do I look for on my Linux system to tell if I'm vulnerable?
All right, so I can't say definitively if you're running Linux now.
Yep. And you have a live system.
Well, I can say that like everyone's vulnerable because you haven't updated your DBX. You know why you haven't updated your DBX? Because there's no DBX update that basically puts the shim in this revocation.
So let's say there is a DBX update, and on a live running system, how can I tell whether or not I'm vulnerable because I don't have the right version of shim or I don't have the DBX update?
If you've got the DBX update that includes this vulnerable version of shim in the revocation list, and you haven't updated shim to the latest version that's not in the DBX,
it won't boot.
And secure boot's enabled, it won't boot.
Okay.
Right. So that's one thing.
Right, so I
know what you're getting at though. Like, how do I know what version of shim is on my system?
Yep.
And if it's vulnerable or not?
Right.
I don't have a great answer to that because, like all things when we talk about UEFI and bootloaders, like it depends, right? So like on Ubuntu, I don't know did I send you those commands? I had some commands.
FW update.
No, I talked to one of my coworkers who's been on the show before, Jesse Michael, because I posed this question to the group just today, and I was like, how do we know what version of shim I have? How do I determine which version of shim I have? And it's very distribution dependent and dependent on the configuration of your distribution and how you've configured secure boot. Some distributions like Ubuntu kind of take care of that for you. Other distributions like I run Arch and Manjaro kind of leave it up to you as to how you want to configure secure boot, because there's lots of options. A lot of people that run Arch Linux, for example, may decide to take on the chain of trust themselves, put their own PK on the system, put their own CAC on the system, and maintain the chain of trust themselves. I'm not a huge fan of that. I hate that. I think that's it's a lot of work and maintenance. Ubuntu kind of takes care of that for you and will load shim and support secure boot out of the box. And I can send you some of the things that Jesse sent me that it doesn't give like a version of Shim, but it gives a hash of Shim.
Okay, that's
so like
fair
for
enough.
all Ubuntu. So like I check some of my Arch Linux systems, and the Shim I have has a certain like MD5 hash,
Sure.
right? So I know that that's the version I'm running.
And that's
right?
reasonable.
Yeah.
That's I mean, for
But like
my purposes,
on
that's
mine,
reasonable.
like when I was trying to figure out, like, does Shim come down as a package, or is it put there in
does
install
Shim, how
time?
does Shim get there?
And it's distribution dependent. On Manjaro, what I figured out is that I actually ran the pacman command to say, hey, this file that I have on my computer, tell me which package that's associated with.
Yep.
And it said, error, this file is not associated with a package.
Oof.
I'm like, oh. And then you go read the wiki page for Arch Linux on how to enable secure boot, and there's a ton of different options that you need to do. But Ubuntu and other distributions, configure that differently. So one of the other things that needs to happen is we need to get a new version of Shim. We need to get assigned to a Microsoft's third-party CA, and that needs to be the new version so that when you apply the DBX update, you've got a non-vulnerable version of Shim, right? It doesn't prevent the bring your own bootloader attack, like I'm bringing my own vulnerable version of Shim to compromise your system style attack, but it does patch the bootloader for other attack paths, like specifically if I'm going to use that Linux system to run like DHCP in a web server to serve a bootloader. If that bootloader is vulnerable, I want to make sure that I have a patch for that because I'm serving it from that Linux system. So there's that. That's like an edge kind of case.
And admittedly, that MD5 hash is amazing. And I think probably as a community, we need to start collecting MD5 hashes of Shim, because that seems to be a really good way to identify that. And I have a vested interest in this, that, working for a finite state, we create SBOMs and we take a system and we want to know what's in it. And like knowing what version of Shim is there that might be vulnerable to this is important.
Correct.
But even before the DBX update, so that we have some insight as to whether or not the DBX update might solve some of these problems, put us in a better spot. And, are we going to do the DBX update and so forth? And yeah, it was a great comment, Paul, that you had when we were talking today, that like, I don't know of many IoT devices that use
specifically
UEFI or secure boot at all. And I'm like, well, so we don't just do IoT, we do all sorts of other stuff too, including like Ubuntu and other Linux file systems and all those types of things. So it might, and we're actually starting to see IoT manufacturers, if you want to use broad term, actually starting to leverage secure boot, but it may not be the UEFI standard secure boot type of stuff.
Oftentimes it's different. Different flavor of secure boot, right?
Yep.
Like someone pointed out, I think like a YouTube comment or something, that Apple's ditched like EFI.
Yep.
Entirely, and they have their own process for that. And sure, that's absolutely true. It's been a fun week.
Yeah, it's kind of terrifying, and no good solution to the problem currently.
But also, it's indicative of like another dumpster fire that happens when we try to take open source software like Linux and adhere it to a standard like UEFI secure boot. Like there's always been issues. There is another standard kind of being proposed that I don't fully understand yet, but it's called SBAT, and it's a different way of validating this software in the context of secure boot. And I don't have a full. I'd have to bring one of my coworkers to explain it better, but that is one of the alternatives, because one of the situations that we'd run in this scenario is that your DBX, and you've heard us talk about in the show, in the past year or so. So DBX is, when we say the DBX, what we're really referring to is a UEFI variable that is allocated variable in the NVRAM partition in UEFI, or specifically your SPY flash.
Yep.
The DBX has a finite amount of space that it can take up, and that space is typically 32 kilobytes. I want to say, like, up into this time, like when we revoked a whole bunch of Grub 2 certificates, or hashes rather, and there's certificates in there too. That's another conversation. But like conceivably, we filled up like 50% of that. Now, if you look at like all the other things that we need to revoke today, keeping in mind there may need to be more that we need to revoke in the future, we start shrinking down that space, and what do we do? And I believe that's a scenario that the SBAT that you can read if you go to Red Hat's Shim GitHub, it describes that as like they realized this years ago and was like, well, crap, like we only have a finite amount of space. Like, what are we going to do?
Yeah, this reminds me of, taking this to my world, the Zigbee stuff, in that when we start talking Zigbee and one of the profiles, SEP, for smart energy, the smart energy profile, the initial ones were based around some proprietary elliptic curve cryptography, and they moved that outside of that intellectual property to TLS. The problem was their implementation of TLS is because the packet size is so small, they can't do a big data transfer at time of connect to do a distribution of a certificate revocation list. So we don't need that at all.
But that's one of the advantages of HTTP boot over Pixie,
right?
Is that it uses TCP to transfer bootloaders, kernel images, in all that other stuff, and it's way more reliable.
Arguably, HTTPS uses TCP as well, but there's another layer on top of that.
Well, then, UEFI ships with like in the Linux equivalent of the CA certificates package. So like as long as you get a valid certificate, you can use HTTPS, and you should be using that. Not many people use that. Now, look, having said that, I think Dimitri posed a question like, and this is a common question, like how many people are using secure boot, and how many people are using HTTP boot, and how many people are using Pixie? Like, look, I can't answer those questions because like I legit don't know.
Right.
I get a sense of that when I go searching on the internet for these kind of things, which I have, recently been searching for, like what's the difference between HTTP boot and Pixie? Like specifically, I kind of knew someone in the back of my mind, right? And then I'm like, and so I come across articles that are like, oh, I configure my systems this way. And then I'm like, well, how many computers ship with HTTP boot by default and Pixie boot by default? And also like the Pixie boot question kind of burns in my mind because we had the Pixie fail vulnerabilities by Quarks Labs, right? So I'm like, can you disable Pixie boot? And the answer is all of that is like, it depends, right? Like some OEMs give you the facilities to disable or enable Pixie boot. Some also
it should be a part of the BIOS.
Disable HTTP boot by default. Like again, like your mileage varies. What I did get a sense of, and again, like not hard data, but I did get a sense of, my personal belief is that Pixie boot and HTTP boot is probably being used more than you think.
Oh yeah.
Right. Because you may not use that in your network, but like if you've got thousands of systems as a fallback or other kind of mechanism, I don't know. Tyler, Lee, do you want to weigh in? Like, how often have you seen Pixie boot and HTTP boot used in environments? I feel like it's used more than we think.
I think it's application specific. There was a time when diskless boot was really big all over, and now I see it confined. I don't see it in unclassified. I see it more in classified systems. And then there's also the thin client things, which aren't exactly the same.
Right.
Pixie boot has kind of gone away. Like, there just hasn't been as much need. Like, Pixie boot back in the day, and you had the out of box experience, OBE for Microsoft, and the auto deployment stuff. But you see a lot of that being replaced with the Intune and the Intune policy deployments, where you're registering a system prior, and it handles all of the config, the installation, the domain, all the registration stuff. That's all handled by Intune via an account and the auto adding to Azure AD. So most of that's taken care of.
Locally, if you have enough privileges to the EFI partition, you can change the boot order. There's commands in Linux, EFI boot manager, right? You can manipulate the boot process,
and so
the boot order, I should say. And you can look at that. So if you're on Linux and you run EFI boot MGR, you can actually see what it's set to on your system.
And in my experience, might be a little dated because I just had to build an actual desktop system. But it was really using a really old motherboard. Like, we won't even talk about how old this thing was. But I also pull that to what I build for virtual machines. I build, I don't know, I'd estimate 30 virtual machines a month and destroy a whole bunch of them. But if you think about, me for VMware Fusion or whichever, that as part of the boot process there, Pixie is still a thing. Like, when I forget to attach the CD-ROM to do a thing with a thing, and
it goes out over the network.
It goes to Pixie, whether or not it's HTTP or anything like that. And I will say, even with that hardware system actual physical system that I built, disk was bad and nothing on it, and it went to Pixie by default in the BIOS to do that. So
it goes on the network. Hey, are you my mother? Can you boot me? Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Nothing creepy there.
Nope. But I did, like, if I were to go to Newegg today and buy a modern motherboard, would that still be the case? Plug it in and not put a disk on it and see what it does? Would it go to Pixie?
Yep.
It would. Largely, I've found that it would. Yeah.
Like, so there you go.
My experience, it does.
Like, if you ever have a hard drive failure and it doesn't work and it's going to go to Pixie, and there's somebody embedded in your network.
Yeah, granted, someone has to be on the network and control DHC, or at least have a DHCP server that has a race condition that it's going to answer first. Then it can provide a host name for it to.
These are all
then HTTP boot off of that. I'm not saying like it's
reasonable.
It's all these are. But again, I think we need to explore the attack paths.
Yeah,
that happen with this stuff. I mean, because there's also like whole like Linux like websites that are like, oh, if you just point HTTP boot at us, like you can boot Linux from us over the internet. Like, whoa, that's.
And you know what? Like, this was one of the things that I was dealing with this week, is that I'm trying to build a VM to support some tools for some of our sales team. And it's like a personal project. Like, we want to understand this other tool better. And the folks on the sales team can't go and install this on their M2 Mac because it's ARM based. I'm like, well, great. I can get you a virtual machine. You can run this. So I'm using UTM, and like, you can go to the UTM store to go boot an image. And I'm like, it probably does it just like that. And don't get me started. Like, UTM can virtualize x86 on ARM, and it's about what I expected. It's a turd. It's slow. So I go to install this package on ARM native, and it fails because of some problem with the install script that uses the exec command on bash. And it's like, what? No, something. It's stupid. And Paul, I think it's probably very similar to a tool that you tried to install before that you had a problem with, and I had no problem with.
Your mileage will vary.
Yes.
So I think the next steps for me with the Shim vulnerability is to better understand and prove out some of these attack paths.
Yeah,
I think is where. And again, if someone does it and wants to tell me about it, I'm happy. Like, whoever proves this out, like, let's talk about it, because I think this is important, because there's a lot of speculation and like, am I really vulnerable? What's the real impact? Can you really exploit it over this, that, or the other thing? Because there's a lot of nuances here. So, and also we're kind of holding out for what happens next with Microsoft, the DBX, with Shim, with SBAT. Like, there's a lot of unknowns.
We gotta wait.
We're in a waiting game now. So also, I do theorize that you could use this to bypass secure boot on Windows systems too. So I don't think this is just a Linux issue, but I also think you could bring any vulnerable bootloader that's not in the DBX to a Windows system. I think the important point to make is one that Matthew Garrett made in the Ars Technica article, is that this is not necessarily persistence, right? I think this is one of the saving graces in this particular vulnerability, is that I don't get persistence in UEFI, right? Because all this is happening after I exit boot services. This is all bootloader stuff. So there's not necessarily, you could essentially wipe the system and recover, unlike a vulnerability in a UEFI where it's a lot more persistent. So, Tyler, any thoughts, questions, comments?
Now I'm excited to play with this one, to be honest. There's a lot of interesting possibilities. There's a lot of nuance to this, but this could get bad. I mean, with all the other fires going on right now, like let's just throw this on top and see what happens.
Yeah, like holy crap, glibc.
I mean, before we hit there to do some stuff here, I'd love to hear a story from Lee and one from Tyler, given that we don't have a ton of time left.
So sure. I mean, one of the ones I was thinking about, and you mentioned it earlier,
was your story number 3, the Thanksgiving incident.
Yeah, which was,
different context than when we talk about Thanksgiving.
No, different context than we use in house. But Cloudflare detected a hacker on their Atlassian server. They did some triage. They hired CrowdStrike to help them. They kicked the person out on the 24th. And what's really cool here is that they talk about all the forensics they did, and they got back to the root cause, which was back in October, roughly October 23rd. There were a series of credentials that were posted as compromised that they didn't invalidate one of the 3 because they had detected it wasn't in use. And guess what?
It was.
But it was from the Okta leak breach across that they leverage it. The thing about this is a good walk back of what happened, and it's kind of neat. I like it because it's like, if you don't know what you've really got to get to and the onions you need to pull apart all the layers, it's a good write-up.
Like that's good. That's like, Lee, that's great. Like, hey, we had that Okta breach, and many people were like, oh great, Okta doesn't affect me, until it affects someone upstream from you, like Cloudflare.
This is where the commercial space really has this wrong, and or the big picture view is not getting disseminated to executives or commercial space leadership. Because when we start to evaluate this, if you looked at this from like a gov standpoint or an APT actor, right, like the Okta breach was huge because of the access it allows to upstream providers and or supply chain, right? Like most of us knew that, or were trying to scream this out, like evaluating who used Okta that is part of your supply chain or that is part of your upstream provider that allows access to network. Now you start to think about this from all of the things that have happened and how this particular breach played out. What is their end goal here from the actor standpoint? Like, what were they after, and or what sat behind Cloudflare that they needed access to in a very specific way that they held on to the Okta for that long, leveraged it in a very specific way, and then moved upstream to something else? Like, what was the something else, and or what impact does that have on the commercial space? Maybe not on the commercial space, maybe some big things on the government side. Like, these are the big picture and long-standing operations that have chained together ramifications that most people just don't consider and or think big enough for how all of these breaches affect them. We look at all these edge devices. Yeah, that's really bad. That gets you access to things, but what does that device sit on that gets access to something else that then provides that chain reaction into things that are very difficult to get to? That is how actors, particularly APT actors in China or Russia, that's the long-term and big picture operations that people just aren't considering. They're thinking it's one-off, it's an attacker, they're just trying to get to this piece of data, or they're just trying to breach a network for ransomware. Like, that's smoke and mirrors. Let's be real. Let's all smoke and mirrors. What is the end goal, and how do we protect and help stop these particular actors across these organizations?
I agree, Tyler. It's almost like we watch too many hacker movies.
No.
And it was right. So think of it this way: War Games is the lone computer hacker in his bedroom, hacking into stuff, right?
Yeah.
You say basement, right? In the movie, it was his bedroom hacking into stuff, right? In Sneakers, it was a professional team, right? So they had a monetary goal, and they were a professional team, very much tied to government, and they were, some of them were ex-government working on the professional team to do that. Hackers was the classic 90s hacker group. right? Like a team,
almost hacktivist-ish.
Yeah, like a team, but not like a professional team. We're just like a bunch of people that are hacking for a cause and creating culture and community around our hacker group. But like I think
arguably some hacktivism to go with that.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of times we kind of get mixed up in what nation states and groups are doing today, which is very much not just coordinated, but to Tyler's point, thinking about the long game, right? Yeah, and all those 3 movies and all the scenarios that you can extrapolate into real life and things that happened, it was very short-term goals, access to systems, exploring that kind of thing, whether you're the lone hacker or you have a professional target or whether you were in a hacker group.
This is why I like Black Hat as a movie. Like, this is why I keep advocating for Black Hat.
It was what was the Live Free or Die Hard, right? There was it was a long game there too, as well. It's a great point. And so we have to take that into account today. The groups after our systems could be in it for that long term play.
We're not just thinking like people have a hard time thinking like 1 month, what's on fire this quarter, maybe even this year. Like, okay, we'll do a year-end recap, but this is, we're not thinking even the Western mindset has a very difficult time of getting past that 1, 3, and 5 year mark, right? Like when you're talking about Chinese hackers or even Russian, you're talking about a 50, 100, 300 year war. How do they establish the Belt and Roads Act? How do they establish long-term dominance globally? This is not a 1, 5, or even 7 year plan. This is a 100-year war, and our Western mind has a very difficult time conceptualizing and strategizing around that, especially with inside of careers and or day job. That's very difficult, but we have to adopt that mindset in order for our adversarial mind to combat the threat and the risk vectors in a big enough picture to then deal with the situation at hand. And that's just what we're not doing.
It's crazy.
Yeah. I want to dig into some of the Qualys vulnerabilities because this broke last Wednesday, and I didn't end up getting it in the show last week. And there are some really interesting things here. So, my story number 16. Let's start with Q sort. So, the Qualys team basically released 2 advisories. One got a CVE, one didn't, and we'll explain why. In the first one, story number 16. Because there's no CVE associated with it, they got to name it and entitle it however they wanted.
Give it a theme song.
They said for the algorithm lovers, non-transitive comparison functions lead to out-of-bounds read and write in glibc's Q sort. There's some really nerdy computer science stuff going on in this post.
Nerdy to me, Paul.
Right? I've read this article probably 3 or 4 times, and I enjoy it every time I read it.
Nice.
I can't do it justice in I wish I could do it like a better service in explaining it to you as the audience, so I compel the audience to go read this, because when you read it, you understand it. But since I don't live it every day in code, every day, especially like in C, I don't have that ability to do it like great justice in explaining it to you. So I'll give you some of the highlights that I pulled out of it. So basically, there's a flaw in the QSort function inside of glibc. And what they say is, to be vulnerable, a program must call QSort with a non-transitive comparison function. So what that means is there's basically flaws on both sides. There's flaws in the way glibc is implementing its QSort function, but there has to be also a vulnerable program that's calling that function in a vulnerable way. Now, what glibc has said is that, we didn't implement that the right way. And they kind of flip-flop back and forth if you read the article as to we're going to fix it this way, we're going to fix it this way, we're going to implement a different sorting function. Those with a computer science background, you take computer programming classes, right? You go through all the different bubble sorts and different kind of sorting functions, right? And it gets really nerdy. It's math and computer science, all rolled into one when you talk about sorting, right? And so what glibc said is that we're not necessarily vulnerable because it requires that an external program call our function that has a bug in it in a vulnerable way. Therefore, we're not going to issue a CVE. CVEs should be issued to programs that use a non-transitive comparison function to call us. So the vulnerability is in the calling program, not in glibc, but also we fixed the vulnerability. We fixed it.
So it can't be called a non-transitive way.
That's
So
BS.
it can't be called a
That's
non-transitive way.
BS, right?
My comment. So this one I also put it like on our internal, Slack channel and Eclipse. I was like, I don't know how I feel about this, but I kind of feel like this is bullshit. Like it should be. If you fix something that's security related, that would mean it's a vulnerability in software. It should have it. That's the whole purpose of a CVE.
Yep.
Like also, a quick side note: if you fix the vulnerability in a later version of software, but there's a vulnerability that exists in a previous version of software, there should be a CVE issued for that version of software that has a vulnerability, because that's like pretty much the definition of CVE is to define a condition where software is vulnerable in a certain thing, and we should publicize that and assign a CVE to it.
But it's not really our fault.
Companies aren't going to assign priority, and or vuln management programs are not going to get this fixed and identify areas in which this is being used without a CVE.
Shenanigans and tomfoolery with the CVEs.
QSort vulnerability, all glibc versions from September 1992 to the current release 2.38 are affected. Like, holy crap. My other kind of thinking on this is, so this is an open question, I don't know the answer. Can you create like a semgrep rule that looks through source code to find programs that are using a non-transitive comparison function? I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to leave that as an exercise to our audience, those that are smarter than me on this issue and more involved in this particular issue. I don't know the answer. I read this post that does a great job of explaining and exemplifying transitive versus non-comparison functions. What that means, they do a great job of, if A is less than B, if A is greater than B, and whatever, and it should return basically a properly coded function should return a +1, a 1, or a 0 based on this comparative functions. There's a right way to do that. There's a wrong way to do that. The right way to do that is with a transitive comparison function. The wrong way to do it is with a non-transitive comparison function, from what I understand. Again, my story number 16, if you read that, I can't do it justice. I was trying to explain it on our call with the host on Tuesday, and we were like, our brains were exploding.
Semgrep. Okay. Yeah. Been dealing with that lately. And transitive properties, I can understand that because we use transitive properties of XOR all the time in wireless stuff. Yep. So Lee, you even learned about that when you took that with me in eons ago, right?
I know, that sounded really damn familiar, didn't it?
Yeah, the transitive property of XOR. If you know any two values, you can determine the third.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. It looks like though what they were commenting in the article about, this is fine if you've got a robust version of QSort, but if you don't have the robust version, you're going to get the memory corruption.
Correct.
So they just made a fix so QSort was robust, but didn't necessarily fix how people were using it. So it returns an improperly sorted list, but no more memory corruption.
I thought it was also interesting that they stumbled upon this. They said, while browsing through postfix's history file, we stumbled across a puzzling entry from February 2002, which described a similar situation of vulnerabilities arising from non-transitive comparison functions. I thought, dude, where did you, how did you get to hone in on an entry from a postfix history file from 2002 that led you to since they had the vulnerability, maybe we'll look in glibc for the vulnerability. I'm really impressed. I'm actually really impressed. I'm really impressed. I'm that's
beer me.
The post came from, it was a comment about Solaris QSort versus others. I'm returning segment validation errors. from a gentleman at Morgan Stanley. I'm like, holy crap.
But
Yeah,
also,
how did they find that?
I think their write-up, I read a lot of vulnerability descriptions. Their write-up is like an A+. Like, and you got extra credit for like the whole thing. Like I'm super impressed with their write-up. However impactful this vulnerability is, to me, that doesn't matter. The way that they wrote this up, absolutely stunningly amazing in my assessment. So great link to like why you want to use transitive comparisons and not non-transitive comparisons. They link to a really cool paper. Subtraction is not comparison, which when you read the description, that'll make sense. The threat landscape is really interesting. So they say we have not tried to find a vulnerable program, i.e. a program that uses a non-transitive comparison function to Q-sort in a tracker-controlled elements. However, vulnerable programs are certain to exist in the real world because calls to Q-sort are extremely common. Non-transitive comparison functions are also common. So again, it's kind of left up to the community at large to find the vulnerable calling functions, which they claim, even though they didn't like try and find it, but they claim they've looked at a lot of open source code, right? I know the Qualys team that's doing this research. We've interviewed a couple of them in the past, right, in previous episodes, and they're very much in tune as to like how open source code is being coded. They read through this code to find these vulnerabilities, right? They're not relying on AI and machine learning. Like they're basically like
It's manual analysis.
we're doing our own human investigation and like reading through the code to find this stuff. So I thought that was really cool. Now they also found another vulnerability. This one has a CVE 2023-6246. It's a heap-based buffer overflow in glibc syslog. Some have said this could be like a new log4j kind of style vulnerability. My interesting notes here are, I thought this was absolutely amazing. And I think Sergey talked about Solar Designer. Did he talk about Solar Designer?
He did.
So this heap-based buffer overflow in glibc, they said in December 1997, Solar Designer published information about a very similar vulnerability in vsyslog of the old Linux libc. And they put a link. They put a link to that. Similar vulnerability from 1997. I think if you're bug hunting, especially open source code today, it behooves you to go read some of the old vulnerabilities from the 90s and see where they crop up today. Right?
And it's not the correct quote. Those who do not learn from history are destined to repeat themselves. There's more to that quote, but it's still applicable.
There's a proof of concept there. That determines if your system is vulnerable or not, and totally works like core dumps. If you run that one-liner on a vulnerable system like I have, totally core dumps. Right? And then they go through and they describe in detail how that heap overflow works. Again, really awesome. I favor the Q-sort description in my mind is like Pony Award winning material.
Nice.
In my mind. So
to give a quick transition, steal thunder a little bit here. You talk about amazing write-ups. My story number 6, hacking a smart home device. Talking about amazing write-ups. I think you read this one too.
I didn't. I tried to read it, but like once I got through Shim and Avanti fried. And the Qualys ones, by the time I got to this one, my brain was so tired I couldn't. Hopefully you digested it.
I only got a little bit of time to digest this, but hacking a smart home device was. It wasn't so much that we're looking for epic hacks to exploit a device. It was there's a smart home device that doesn't have support to integrate into my preferred home control, and we want to support it. And the article, the sort of the disclaimer up at the front, like, we're not hacking this to do bad things and reverse engineering. No, it's not reverse engineering. It's compatibility engineering. Like you're taking this device and you're modifying it to be compatible with your stuff. Like, because that was the old bad thing about reverse engineering. So there's this humidifier and he wants to integrate it into his home control system. So and it's not supported currently. So let's go figure out how we can do that. And it's got a mobile app, and they go and review the Android mobile app, and they don't get a lot out of it. So then they examine network traffic, and they don't get a lot out of that. A little bit. They get some endpoints and some stuff, and well, great. We've got the device, so let's disassemble it. And sure enough, it's using really common stuff like the ESP32 room, WROOM. And they figure out where the serial connection is, and they start getting some messages on the serial port, and they can dump the flash, and they can now analyze the flash and start getting data out of that. Finding out they could have been protected, but it wasn't. Looking through the storage on the flash and so forth and so on, and start looking at doing some reverse engineering with like Ghidra to go walk through all the instruction sets for this particular stuff and end up modifying the firmware so that it can support all of the stuff, and including all the checksum functionality. And like, holy crap, the length that they went through to do the reverse analysis, to modify packets and to discover the packet contents, which is arguably MQTT at the end of it, which is well documented, but it's encrypted MQTT, my understanding. To be able to man in the middle or machine in the middle these devices so that they can implement it with their home control of choice was just freaking amazing. Like, holy crap. It's arguably they do some, interception to MQTT. It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
A lot of work.
Yeah.
But not outside of the realm of possibility. Like, take these techniques and apply them to your device. Like, Paul, you and I have talked about in the last couple of weeks about a number of devices like the Christmas tree. We could probably use similar types of techniques to hack said Christmas tree. And we talked about the denial of pleasure attacks against some Bluetooth low energy connected sex toys.
I think
similar types of things could attack.
The bar there is, I think, some of those devices use a similar technique to like rolling codes that you'd find on a key fob to unlock a car. Right. So then it's like, how much work do you want to put into hacking your sex toy or your Christmas tree kind of thing? And I think a lot of the shenanigans that you see about stuff that ends up like on the flipper are things that don't use rolling codes, right? And that's really like the delineation, right?
And arguably on the Bluetooth low energy stuff, similar to a rolling code, it's got a pin and it's going to retain that. It's called bonding, but the pins are potentially limited. You could potentially brute force all of that stuff, and there's lots of other
same thing with rolling codes too. I mean, that's essentially what you come down to. Is you got to brute force the rolling code.
But rolling code is, you're not so much brute forcing it. The rolling code stuff is time based, and if you do denial service for signals, you could affect that time based stuff. And the pins with something like Bluetooth low energy and those types of things are not time based.
Right, or opportunistic.
Right.
We talked about this, right? You grab the code in the air. Yep. And then you prevented the key fob from talking again, and so that's still the current code because it hasn't rolled yet. Right. Basically, yeah. That's some of I think the shenanigans I see with the Flipper Zeros. Oh, look, I can unlock this car. Like,
there's no rolling code.
Yeah, but like either there isn't a rolling code, or if there is, like you've got the last code that before it like rolled again kind of thing, or the awful scenario where like you have the key fob in your pocket and it's off camera, and you're not really using the flipper to unlock the car. You're using the freaking key fob,
and or with stuff like some of the unoriginal Rice Patty and some of the subsequent stuff like. It used a rolling code, but the rolling code was still valid for 24 plus hours. Right. Even time-based. Even if it had already rolled.
Yeah. Right.
It's still, even if you have an old code, it's still valid for a long period of time.
Right. I think there's a lot of people playing shenanigans on that stuff now, which is disappointing.
Yeah. personally, I loved this particular write-up because it went so far in depth to hack this stupid, simple device. Something you would think would be a stupid, simple device to integrate your home control system by hacking it. And arguably, they did a pretty darn good job trying to secure it to prevent this type of stuff. But just open up an API, really, like make this work.
I wanted a follow-up to our EPSS discussion from last week.
Oh, yeah.
Predictability scoring system. Is that what it stands for?
Yep.
Did I get that right? Exploit prediction scoring system. So it represents a probability of exploitation in the wild during the next 30 days in the range from 0 to 1.
Yep.
So a 0.96 has a 96% chance to be exploited in the following days. How is that calculated? These are some of the, just again, clarifications from last week based on the article that I found that I thought did a good job of describing it.
And this is your story number?
This is my story number 12.
Great.
So behind the scoring system lies a machine learning algorithm that is trained on a data set of all the exploitations observed in the past day. Additional to that data set, details such as vendor, age, MITRE CVE, CVSS, and CWE, and more. The model learns connection between the vulnerabilities and exploitation attempts observed, then generates a prediction based on these findings. EPSS and CVSS have a relationship, but they don't always necessarily agree. My advice is that's all reasons why you shouldn't rely on either of them to determine your course of action when responding to a particular vulnerability.
It should be only 1 point of analysis. And
am I screwed or am I not? How screwed am I if I patch this or not? Right. So it's essentially what coming down to.
And I will totally relate this to something coming up. So I'm speaking at CactusCon next week. And Cactus.
That's a throwback.
Totally Cactus.
RBCP.
Yep. Cactus. Love you, man. And a derivative or a more advanced high level of this talk at RSA. For doing some analysis on some stuff, and it comes down to S-bombs and their enrichment, and the stuff that I found is vulnerable. The problem is that when you do the analysis and you do the S-bomb generation, you do the version matching, the version that this particular software package uses is different than the standard version matching, meaning at deployment time, at build of image, it uses the current Git version. So the version that this software, this firmware uses is the Git version and not the version .08. So it doesn't match and give the CVE, CPE definitions.
Correct. Yeah, you can't rely on the version of the software to tell you what software you're actually running.
Right.
You can't rely on hash to say that's the same software that's running
because
here.
In this case, it's based on a specific pull request, effectively version.
Right. It's dicey to rely on. We decompiled it and then we looked for vulnerabilities because that's better. That's better than the previous methods we mentioned. That's probably what I would recommend you do is you decompile on the fly and then you look for vulnerabilities, and that's cool. I like that method, but that's also like it's hard. It's hard.
To make matters worse, in my case, that sure I can do the correlation that this particular Git version falls under this version of this software, meaning it should be vulnerable, and then you compare that to threat intelligence around stuff.
What's being exploited in the wild?
What's being exploited in the wild? What has proof of concept available, and you name it, and all the threat intelligence sources I leveraged had no threat intelligence for it.
No data for it, yeah.
Yet a 30-second Google search turned proof of concept code.
Right.
But the page that had the proof of concept code for the folks that released that populated the CVE was all in Chinese.
Yeah. I've seen that.
And so
it's usually Chinese or Russian.
All of the threat intelligence sources have no concept of the proof of concept. Yet the proof of concept is there, and it is fully exploitable. But
the other factor of that is how accessible is it. So I picked on a Avanti that someone had analyzed the firmware, and found they're running really old open source software. And I will caveat that with, it could not be reachable in its current version.
Sure.
Which is not to say that you shouldn't patch it, but speaks to the immediate severity and level of remediation that you apply to it at that particular given time. That's not to say in the next firmware release they haven't mitigated that vulnerability, but maybe the attack path allows an attacker to exploit that vulnerability in that version, but doesn't in the previous version, and or vice versa.
Yep.
So how do we? I think we're in an interesting point in time where it's extremely difficult for organizations to gauge the severity of any particular vulnerability.
Yep.
And that's the premise of my talk that I've submitted at least to one conference, right?
The CV
is
tomfoolery.
like, how do we do this? Like, it's really hard to do that today.
Case in point, in this particular case, the component that was vulnerable is remotely exploitable, and there are 61,000 of these devices that are available in Shodan. But you don't know which version of this component is listening on a port via Shodan. So you can't tell exactly. But this is always listening, unless you've turned it off specifically, always listening on your internal interface.
I mean, the thing is too, though, like,
Open word.
if we take two opposite ends of the spectrum, you can't patch nothing, and you can't patch everything.
Correct.
So the hard part is, where do we meet in the middle? And it's the where we meet in the middle that is exactly what Larry and I are talking about.
Yeah.
Of, well, how do I understand the context?
What I need to patch and what I don't.
I can't understand, like, we haven't provided the right tools and data to organizations to, like, really nail shit. This is what I really need to be patching today, because none of these things, CVE, CVSS, EPSS, all of the S-bombs with VEX and the whole thing, none of that. I mean, they're guides, but they don't really get us to the end goal of what the fuck do I need to patch first.
Yep.
And then
Tyler,
then you add in the complexity of, like, very large. I'm dealing with this right now at work, like the very large places at scale across multiple asset owners and business stakeholders that have business ROI requirements and or goals outside of security. You go around trying to patch their stuff, even if security has good buy-in, has great relations. You go patching stuff and cause a break in business process and someone else's stakeholder or asset
operational
inventory.
Risk.
Operational side, you are burning both political capital as well as trust, and or you run into battles at scale in realms that you just don't have the capability to do this, and or technical. Like, yeah, we can solve this technically, kind of, when you put risk and you add custom matrix and tagging for different departments, and you build in, your own risk rating across CVE and CVSS, and do all the things. Say you get all the technical pieces right. All of those risks get really, really close, and then you try to fix those risks, and that doesn't necessarily equal any kind of technical aptitude or capability. You are simply fighting a business risk decision and what is acceptable at a given time.
I wish I had better answers, but I worked in vulnerability management for some time, and I still, to this day, sitting here today, don't
have a good answer. I don't have
great answers.
It's gonna vary between organization and business unit, and arguably we need to go back to the first segment of the interview with Sergey and do a way better job up front.
Yeah, but that's like, also we have to rely on the supply chain to give us better quality and reduce our attack surface of what we're consuming, right? It's one aspect of it, and then we have to deal with what do we triage and actually fix, and then the third component is what can we mitigate and detect kind of after the fact, right? That's where I think like EDR and like network monitoring is like, well, that's shit that you basically like slip through the cracks. Like that's the last
step
leg.
in step 1 and 2, like until that becomes financially motivated, there'll be no reason to.
I still, in saying all of that, I still lean towards a more patch first, ask questions later approach to things. That's where I lean.
Yep. I agree.
I know it's hard, and Tyler brings a great point of operational risk, but like I still lean towards patch first, ask questions later kind of thing. Yep. But again, that has its drawbacks as well.
And I'll take the approach of let's go for the snow crash approach, and that assume everyone's vulnerable, and that you just fuck it. We'll assume that something's vulnerable and nothing's private anymore, and including our brains.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of terrifying.
It is.
I'm going to go back to delivering pizza.
So how about a segue to your number one story, Larry?
Oh, crap. What was my number one story?
That was Doom and Amiga.
Oh, man. This was an amazing write-up. And largely because was both fans of Doom, and I was an early Amiga A1000 adopter in the mid 80s. Like we didn't have a lot of money at that point, but my mom managed to find $3,000 to shell out for a used A1000 so that we had an Amiga at home. And to play games on the Amiga in the 80s was far above and beyond any other platform connected to your computer or connected to your TV or computer or otherwise. And this really talked about what the demise of Amiga was. It was amazing, and then and was far above and beyond what either Atari or Sinclair or any Intel-based platform could do for the same amount of price, graphics-wise, and multitasking. Like the original Amiga OS, when bulletin boards first started happening, was like, oh, you got a slow download? That's cool. Just switch over to this other window and you can do some chatting with your friends, and you can use the killer graphics program to edit images, and you could do some programming and you could change those images in real time while your download is happening. So effectively really multi-threaded stuff, far ahead of its time for a reasonable cost. What it really came down to is their commitment to graphics came to hurt them in the end, in that while initially the graphics were amazing and were cheap and were included, the graphics on the IBM PC side, Intel-based, far surpassed them, and the technology really changed. And in order for them to keep up with the new technology, the processor speed had to, increase massively, and the technology just wasn't there to do so. And they would have had to revamp the entire graphics processing on the Amiga, despite the fact that it was already a VGA killer. VGA really killed the Amiga, and it wasn't Doom that killed them. It was the graphics format that became readily available across Intel-based platforms.
Yeah. I mean, I read through the article and they see, 68020, 30, 40, 60, and the speeds they were running, those were amazing CPUs at the time, but they didn't stack up to what they were doing on the Intel side.
Yep.
I remember running 6810, 6820s for business apps in the early 80s with the Tandy business computers were all 68,000 based. Yep. But even they switched to the Intel.
Yep.
But it is a really good art. Brings back some great memories, and he does mention that eventually there was a Doom port for the Amiga, but by the time that came out,
You couldn't keep
That
up.
was sort of passe. Other games were much more popular.
Yeah, like Duke Nukem 3D. I'm all here to kick ass and chew bubblegum, and I'm all out of bubblegum. Like, everybody had
Also,
moved on.
back to one of your references earlier, as we wrap up, because we're running short on time. Do you know why the computer in Hackers was called the Gibson?
William Gibson.
Neuromancer. The cast actually was given copies of Neuromancer and liked it.
Nice.
From what I researched, and would like all sharing like they're almost like a book club, right? They were all like excited about it. So,
So yeah,
that's my other talk.
I'm not necessarily computer security related. I just thought this was a fun article, and me, growing up in my career, I went from the Tandies to the Amiga 1000, which was some of their first releases, and that was an amazing computer for what it did, to the point that like that was what was controlling broadcast stuff. Like I can remember even into the 90s, like sitting down and going to the figuring out what was on TV to see the what was on that little guide channel. And like at the top was supposed to be running ads, but the computer that was supposed to be running ads using the video toaster that was running an Amiga 1000 or a 500 or something with the video toaster had clearly crashed because it was displaying a guru mediation error where the ads should have been run. Like, I know that, like that whole scene with Leonardo DiCaprio, like holding the glass of bourbon. I know that because like I've gotten those
guru meditation,
guru mediation errors.
Yeah, is it meditation or
mediation?
It's mediation.
What
was that an error from? Was that a Amiga?
It was an Amiga.
It was an Amiga computer.
It was an Amiga. And that was the thing. I always thought it was a guru meditation, but if you read it carefully, it's a guru mediation error.
Yeah, your brain plays tricks on you. With
it does.
Yeah, for sure.
Like,
Well, that was a cool flashback. I mean, it's I think that computer line has a soft spot in many of our hearts. So it's nice to
I'd
see
love
a reference to it.
You know what, Lee? I'd love to see like a timeline of all those older computers in terms of computing power, and put like a Raspberry Pi. Like where have we even crossed? Like, are all those before Raspberry Pi? Because I think it's pretty amazing that we could have like a little handheld Raspberry Pi computer. Like where are all those other, in terms of computing power, kind of fare against that? I don't know. I think they'd all be kind of to the left of maybe to the Raspberry Pi, depending on which version of Raspberry Pi or Pico, or I think that would be a.
I'd argue that even at the Pico, the Pico is probably well to the right, more advanced than a good portion.
Of those older computers, right?
Yep. Like, you think about some of the computers that we use to put astronauts on the moon. Like, you could pull out a TI-85 calculator nowadays, and like we're talking TI-85 calculator that we used in high school in the 90s arguably has more processing power than the computer that was used to put astronauts on the moon.
For sure. I think we should wrap there.
We should.
What do you think? Thanks everyone for listening and watching this edition of Paul Security Weekly. We'll see you next time.